Hello, and welcome back to a dramatic reading of His Majesty's Dragon. I'm Nick. The book is by Naomi Novik. It's the Temeraire book series, book one. We are cruising through it, and where we just left you was Lawrence and Temeraire were going to go down, and they're going to get Temeraire bathed. And they're still trying to find their way to being accepted among the Covet and the other members of the Aerial Corps. Let's continue. Wow, excuse me. Temeraire brightened at the prospect of bathing, and after the better part of an hour spent playing with Levitas in the lake and then being scrubbed by the cadets, his spirits were greatly restored. Afterwards, he curled happily about Lawrence in the warm courtyard when they settled down together to read, apparently much happier. But Lawrence still saw Temeraire looking at his gold and pearl chain often, and touching it with the tip of his tongue. He was beginning to recognize the gesture as a desire for reassurance. Kind of cool that Naomi Novik throws in some just like made up dragon behavior. Yeah. Wow, down the wrong tube. He tried to put affection in his voice as he read and stroked the foreleg on which he was comfortably seated. He was still frowning with concern later that evening as he came into the officers' club, a left-handed blessing, for the momentary hush that fell when he came into the room bothered him far less than it might have otherwise done. Granby was standing at the pianoforte near the door, and when he pointedly touched his forehead in salute and said, "Sir," as Lawrence came in. A little sarcasm, I think. And it was an odd sort of insolence that could hardly be reprimanded. Lawrence chose to answer as if it had been sincere, and said politely, "Mr. Granby," and with a nod that made a general gesture to the room. With a nod, he made a general gesture to the room and walked with what haste was reasonable. Rankin was sitting far back in the corner of the room by a small table reading a newspaper. Lawrence joined him. In a few moments, the two of them had set up the chessboard, which Rankin had taken down from a shelf. The buzz of conversation had already resumed. Between moves, Lawrence observed the room as well as he could without making himself obvious. Now that his eyes were open, he could see a few female officers scattered in the crowd here also. Their presence seemed to place no restraint on the general company. The conversation, though good-natured, was not wholly refined, and it was made noisy and confused by interruptions. Nevertheless, there was a clear sense of good fellowship throughout the room, and he could not help feeling a little wistful at his natural exclusion from it. Both by their preference and his own, he did not feel that he was fitted for participation, and it could not but give him a pang of loneliness. But he dismissed it almost at once. A Navy captain had to be used to a solitary existence, and often without such companionship as he had in Temeraire. And also, he might now look forward to Rankin's company as well. He returned his attention to the chessboard and looked no more at the others. Rankin was perhaps a little out of practice, but not unskilled, and as the game was not one of Lawrence's favorite pastimes, they were reasonably well matched. While they played, Lawrence mentioned his concern for Temeraire to Rankin, who listened with sympathy. "It is indeed shameful that they should not have given him precedence, but I must counsel you to leave the remedy to him," Rankin said. "They behave that way in the wild. The deadlier breeds demand first fruits of the hunt, and the weaker give way. He must likely assert himself among the other beasts to be given more respect." "Do you mean by offering some sort of challenge? But surely that cannot be a wise policy," Lawrence said, alarmed at the very idea. He had heard the old fantastic stories of wild dragons fighting amongst themselves and killing one another in such duelings. To allow battle among such desperately valuable creatures for so little purpose? "It rarely comes to an actual battle. They know one another's capabilities, and I promise you, once he feels certain of his strength, he will not tolerate it, nor will he meet with any great resistance," Rankin said. Lawrence could not have great confidence in this. He was certain it was no lack of courage that prevented Temeraire from taking precedence, but a more delicate sensibility, which had unhappily enabled him to sense the lack of approbation among the other dragons. "I would still like to find some means of reassuring him," Lawrence said sadly. He could see that henceforth all the feedings would be a source of fresh unhappiness to Temeraire, and yet they could not be avoided save by feeding him at different times, which would only make him feel still more isolated from the others. "Oh, give him a trinket, and he will settle down," Rankin said. "It is amazing how it restores their spirits. Whenever my beast becomes sulky, I bring him a bauble, and he is at once all happiness again. Just like a temperamental mistress." Lawrence could not help smiling at the absurdity of this joking comparison. "I've been meaning to get him a collar, as it happens," he said more seriously, such as the one Celeritas wears, and I do believe it would make him very happy. But I do not suppose there is anywhere here where such an item may be commissioned." "I can offer you a remedy for that, at any rate. I go to Edinburgh regularly on my courier duties, and there are several excellent jewelers there. Some of them even carry ready-made items for dragons, as there are many coverts here in the north within flying distance. If you care to accompany me, I would be happy to bear you there," Rankin said. "My next flight will be this Saturday, and I can easily have you back by supper time if we leave in the morning." "Thank you. I'm very much obliged to you," Lawrence said, surprised and pleased. "I will apply to Celeritas for permission to go." Celeritas frowned at the request made the next morning and looked at Lawrence narrowly. "You wish to go with Captain Rankin? Well, it will be the last day of liberty you have for a long time, for you must and will be here for every moment of Temeraire's flight training." He was almost fierce about it, and Lawrence was surprised by his vehemence. "I assure you I have no objection," he said, wondering in astonishment if the training master had thought he meant to shirk his duties. "Indeed, I had not imagined otherwise. I am well aware of the need for urgency in his training. If my absence would cause any difficulty, I beg you to have no hesitation in refusing the request." Whatever the source of his initial disapproval, Celeritas was mollified by this statement. "As it happens, the ground crewman will need a day to fit Temeraire out with his new gear, and it will be ready by then," he said in less stern tones. "I suppose we can spare you, as long as Temeraire is not finicky about being harnessed without you there. And you may as well have a final excursion." Temeraire assured Lawrence he did not mind, so the plan was settled, and Lawrence spent the part of the next few evenings making measurements of his neck and of Maximus's, thinking the regal copper's current size might be a good approximation for what Temeraire would reach in future. He pretended to Temeraire that these were for the harness. He looked forward to giving the present as a surprise, and seeing it take away some of the quiet distress that lingered, casting a pall over the dragon's usually high spirits. Rankin looked with amusement at his sketches of possible designs. The two of them had already formed the settled habit of playing chess together in the evenings, and sitting together at dinner. Lawrence so far had little conversation with the other aviators. He regretted it, but could see little point in trying to push himself forward when he was comfortable enough as he was, and in the absence of any sort of invitation. It seemed clear to him that Rankin was as outside the common life of aviators as he was. Yeah, good, Lawrence. I'm glad you're noticing that. Rankin's a little bit sketchy. You can already tell. He was, perhaps set aside by the elegance of his manners. And if they were both outcast for the same reason, they might at least have the pleasure of each other's society, for compensation. He and Berkeley met at breakfast and training every day, and he continued to find the other captain as astute airman and aerial tactician. But at dinner, or in company, Berkeley was silent. Lawrence was not sure either that he wished to draw the man into intimacy, or that a gesture in that direction would be welcome, so he contented himself with being civil and discussing technical matters. So far, they had known each other only a few days. There would be time enough to take a better measure of the man's real character. He had settled himself to react properly. He steeled himself to react properly on meeting Captain Harcourt again. But she seemed shy of his company. He only saw her almost only at a distance, though Temeraire was soon to be flying in company with her dragon, Lily. One morning, however, she was at table when he arrived for breakfast, and in an attempt to make natural conversation, he asked her how her dragon came to be named Lily, thinking it might be a nickname like Volley's. She flushed to her roots again and said very stiffly, "I liked the name. Pray, how did you come to name Temeraire?" "To be perfectly honest, I did not have any idea of the proper way of naming a dragon, nor any way of finding out at the time," Lawrence said, feeling as if he had made a misstep. No one had remarked on Temeraire's unusual name before, and only now that she had brought him to task for it did he guess that perhaps he had raised a sore point with her. I called him after a ship. The first Temeraire was captured from the French, and the one presently in service is a 98-gun three-decker, one of our finest line of battle ships. When he made this confession, she seemed to grow more easy, and said with more candor, "Oh, as you have said as much, I do not mind admitting that it was nearly the same with me. Lily was not properly expected to hatch for another 5 years at the earliest, and I had no notion of a name. When her egg hardened, they woke me in the middle of the night at Edinburgh covert and flung me on a Winchester, and I barely managed to reach the baths before she broke the shell. I simply gaped, and she invited me to give her a name, and I could not think of anything else." "It is a charming name, and perfectly suits her, Catherine." "It is a charming name, and perfectly suits her, Catherine," Rankin said, joining them at the table. "Good morning, Lawrence. Have you seen the paper? Lord Pugh has finally managed to marry off his daughter. Ferrald must be desperately hard up." This piece of gossip, concerning as it did people whom Harcourt did not know at all, left her outside the conversation. Before Lawrence could change the subject, however, she excused herself and slipped away from the table, and he lost the opportunity to further the acquaintance. Is there a connection here? Rankin, right? The few days remaining in the week before the excursion passed swiftly. The training as yet was still more a matter of testing Temeraire's flying abilities and seeing how best he and Maximus could be worked into the formation centered on Lily. Celeritas had them fly endless circuits around the training valley, sometimes trying to minimize the number of wing beats, sometimes trying to maximize their speed, and always trying to keep them in line with one another. One memorable morning was spent almost entirely upside down, and Lawrence found himself dizzy and red-faced at the end of it. The stouter Berkeley was huffing as he staggered off Maximus's back after the final pass, and Lawrence leapt forward to ease him down to the ground as his legs gave out from under him. Maximus hovered anxiously over Berkeley and rumbled in distress. "Stop that moaning, Maximus. Nothing more ridiculous than a creature of your size behaving like a mother hen," Berkeley said as he fell into the chair that the servants had hurriedly brought. "Ah, thank you," he said, taking the glass of brandy Lawrence offered him, and sipped at it while Lawrence loosened his neckcloth. "I'm sorry to have put you under such a strain," Celeritas said when Berkeley was no longer gasping and scarlet. "Ordinarily these trials would be spread over half a month's time. Perhaps I am pressing on too quickly." "Nonsense. I'll be well in a trice," Berkeley said at once. "I know damned well we cannot spare a moment, Celeritas, so do not be holding back on my account." "Lawrence, why are matters so urgent?" Temeraire asked that evening after dinner, as they once again settled down together outside the courtyard walls to read. "Is there a great battle soon, and we are needed for it?" Lawrence folded the book closed, keeping his place with the finger. "No, I'm sorry to disappoint you. But we are too raw to be sent by choice directly into a major action. Still, it is very likely that Lord Nelson will not be able to destroy the French fleet without the help of the long-wing formations presently stationed in England. Our duty will be to take their place, so they may go. That will indeed be a great battle, and though we will not participate in it directly, I assure you our part is by no means unimportant." "No, though it does not sound very exciting," Temeraire said. "But perhaps France will invade us, and then we will have to fight?" He sounded rather more hopeful than anything else. "We must hope not," Lawrence said. "If Nelson destroys their fleet, it will pretty well put paid to any chance of Bonaparte's bringing his army across, though I have heard he has something like 1,000 boats to carry his men. They are only transports, and the Navy could sink them by the dozens if they tried to come across without the protection of the fleet." Temeraire sighed and put his head down over his forelegs. "Oh," he said. Lawrence stroked his nose. "How bloodthirsty you are," he said with amusement. "Do not fear. I promise you we will see enough action when your training is done. There is a great deal of skirmishing over the Channel, for one thing, and then we may be sent in to support a naval operation, or perhaps sent to harass the French shipping independently." This heartened Temeraire greatly, and he turned his attention to the book with restored good humor. Friday they spent in an endurance trial, trying to see how long both dragons could stay aloft. The formation's slowest members would be the two Yellow Reapers, so both Temeraire and Maximus had to be kept to that slower pace for the test, and they went around and around the training valley in an endless circle, while above them the rest of the formation performed a drill under Celeritas' supervision. A steady rain blurred all the landscape below into a gray monotony and made the task still more boring. Temeraire often turned his head to inquire, a little plaintively, how long he had been flying, and Lawrence was generally obliged to inform him that scarcely a quarter of an hour had passed since the last inquiry. Lawrence at least could watch the formation wheeling and diving, their bright colors marked against the pale gray sky. Poor Temeraire had to keep his head straight and level to maintain the best flying posture. After perhaps 3 hours, Maximus began to fall off the pace, his great wings beating more slowly and his head drooping. Berkeley took him back in, and Temeraire was left all alone, still going around. The rest of the formation came spiraling down to land in the courtyard, and Lawrence saw the dragons nodding to Maximus, inclining their heads respectfully. And Maximus must be like, the senior dragon, biggest, maybe the oldest, or at least the most powerful. At this distance, he could not make out any words, but it was clear they were all conversing easily among themselves while their captains milled about, and Celeritas gathered them together to review their performance. Temeraire saw them as well, and sighed a little, though he said nothing. Lawrence leaned forward and stroked his neck, and silently vowed to bring him back the most elegant jewels he could find in the whole of Edinburgh, if he had to draw on half his capital to do so. Lawrence came out into the courtyard early the next morning to say farewell to Temeraire before his trip with Rankin. He stopped short as he emerged from the hall. Levitas was being put under gear by a small group of crew, with Rankin at his head, reading a newspaper and paying little attention to the proceedings. "Hello, Lawrence." "Oh, hello, Lawrence," the little dragon said to him happily. "Look, this is my captain. He has come, and we are flying to Edinburgh today." "Have you been talking with him?" Rankin said to Lawrence, glancing up. "I see you are not exaggerating, and that you do indeed enjoy dragon society. I hope you'll not find yourself tiring of it. You will be taking Lawrence along with myself today. You must make an effort to show him a good pace." "Sorry about that," he told Levitas. "Oh, I will, I promise," Levitas said at once, bobbing his head anxiously. Lawrence made some civil answer and walked quickly to Temeraire's side to cover his confusion. He did not know what to do. There was no possible way to avoid the journey now without being truly insulting. But he felt almost ill. Over the last few days, he had seen more evidence than he liked of Levitas's unhappiness and neglect. The little dragon watched anxiously for a handler who did not come, and if he or his harness had been given more than a cursory wipe, it was because Lawrence had encouraged the cadets to see to him, and asked Holland to continue attending to his harness. To find Rankin, the one responsible for such neglect, was bitterly disappointing. To see Levitas behaving with such servility and gratitude for the least cold attention was painful. Perceived through the lens of his neglect of his dragon, Rankin's remarks about Dragon took on a character of disdain that could only be strange and unpleasant in an aviator. And his isolation from his fellow officers also, rather than an indication of nice taste. Every other aviator had introduced himself with his dragon's name ready to his lips. Rankin alone had considered his family name of more importance, and left Lawrence to find out only by accident that Levitas was assigned to him. But Lawrence had not seen through any of this. I think some of us did, right? Even the first-time readers. And now he found he had, in the most unguarded sort of way, encouraged the acquaintance of a man he could never respect. He petted Temeraire and made him some reassurances meant mostly for his own comfort. "Is anything wrong, Lawrence?" Temeraire said, nosing at him gently with concern. "You do not seem well." "No, I'm perfectly well, I assure you," he said, making an effort to sound normal. "You are quite certain you do not mind my going?" he asked with a faint hope. "Not at all. And you will be back by evening, will you not?" Temeraire asked. "Now that we have finished Duncan, I was hoping perhaps you could read me something about mathematics. I thought it was very interesting how you explained that you could tell where you are when you have been sailing for a long time, only through knowing the time and some equations. Lawrence had been very glad to leave behind mathematics, and after having forced the basics of trigonometry into his head. Certainly, if you like, he said, trying to keep the dismay out of his voice. But I thought perhaps you would enjoy something about Chinese dragons. Oh yes, that would be splendid too. We could read that next, Temeraire said. It is very nice how many books there are, indeed, on so many subjects. It would give Temeraire something to think about and keep him from being distressed. If it would give Temeraire something to think about and keep him from being distressed, Lawrence was prepared to go as far as to bring his Latin up to snuff and read him Principia Mathematica in the original. So he only sighed privately. Very well, then I leave you in the hands of the ground crew. I can see them coming now. Holland was leading the party. The young crewman had attended so well to Temeraire's harness and seen to Levitas with such goodwill that Lawrence had spoken of him to Celeritas and asked to have him assigned to lead Temeraire's ground crew. This is Holland. Lawrence was pleased to see the request had been granted, because this step was evidently a promotion of some significance. There had been some uncertainty about the matter. He nodded to the young man. Mr. Holland, will you be so good as to present me to these other men? He asked. When he had been given all their names and repeated them silently over to fix them in his memory, it's a good leadership skill, a tip there, he deliberately met their eyes in turn and said firmly, I am sure Temeraire will give you no difficulty, but I trust you will make a point of consulting his comfort as you make the adjustments. Temeraire, please have no hesitation about informing these men if you notice the least discomfort or restriction upon your movement. Levitas's case had provided him with evidence that some crewmen might neglect their assigned dragon's gear if a captain was not watchful, and indeed anything else was hardly to be expected. Though he had no fear of Holland's neglecting his work, Lawrence meant to put the other men on notice that he would not tolerate any such neglect where Temeraire was concerned. If such severity fixed his reputation as a hard captain, so be it. Perhaps in comparison to other aviators, he was. He would not neglect what he considered his duty for the sake of being liked. Good for you, Lawrence. A murmur of, very good, and right you are, came in response. He was able to ignore the raised eyebrows and exchanged glances. Carry on, then, he said with a final nod, and turned away with no small reluctance to join Rankin. All his pleasure in the expedition was gone. It was distasteful in the extreme to stand by while Rankin snapped at Levitas and ordered him to hunch down uncomfortably for them to board. Lawrence climbed up as quickly as he could and did his best to sit where his weight would give Levitas the least difficulty. The flight was brief, at least. Levitas was very swift, and the ground rolled away at a tremendous pace. He was glad to find the speed of their passage made conversation nearly impossible, and he was able to give brief answers to the few remarks Rankin ventured to shout. They landed less than 2 hours after they had left, at the great wall covert, which spread out beneath the watchful, looming eye of Edinburgh Castle. Stay here quietly. I do not want to hear that you have been pestering the crew when I return, Rankin said sharply to Levitas. After dismounting, he threw the reins of his harness around the post, and as if Levitas were a horse to be tethered. You can eat when we return to Loch Lagan.
I do not want to bother them, and I can wait to eat, but I am a little thirsty, Levitas said in a small voice. I tried to fly as fast as I could, he added. It was very fast indeed, Levitas, and I'm grateful to you. Of course, you must have something to drink, Lawrence said. This was as much as he could bear. You there, he called to the ground crewmen lounging around the edges of the clearing. None of them had stirred when Levitas had landed. Bring a trough and clean water at once, and see to his harness while you're about it. The men looked a little surprised, but they set to work under Lawrence's hard eye. Rankin did not make any objection, although as they climbed up the stairs away from the covert and onto the streets of the city, he said, I see you are a little tender-hearted towards them. I'm hardly surprised, as that is the common mode among aviators. But I must tell you that I find discipline answers far better than the sort of coddling more often seen. Levitas, for instance, must always be ready for a long and dangerous flight. It is good for him to be used to going without.
Lawrence felt all the awkwardness of his situation. He was here as Rankin's guest, and he would have to fly back with the man in the evening. Nevertheless, he could not restrain himself from saying, "I will not deny having the warmest sentiments towards dragons as a whole. In my experience, thus far, I've found them uniformly appealing, and worthy of nothing but respect. However, I must disagree with you very strongly that providing ordinary and reasonable care in any way constitutes coddling, and I have always found that deprivation and hardship, when necessary, can be better endured by men who have not been subjected to them previously for no cause." "Oh, dragons are not men, you know. But I will not argue with you," Rankin said easily. Perversely, it made Lawrence even angrier. If Rankin had been willing to defend his philosophy, it could have been a sincere, if wrong-headed proposition. But clearly, it was not. Rankin was only consulting his own ease, and these remarks were merely excuses for the neglect he performed. Fortunately, they were at the crossroads when their paths were to diverge. Lawrence did not have to endure Rankin's company any longer, as the man had to go on rounds to the military offices in the city. They had agreed to meet back at the covert before their departure, and he escaped gladly. He wandered around the city for the next hour or so without direction or purpose, solely to clear his mind and temper. There was no obvious way to ameliorate Levitas's situation, and Rankin was clearly inured to disapproval. Lawrence now, which means kind of immune. Lawrence now recalled Berkeley's silence, Harcourt's evident discomfort, the avoidance of the other aviators in general, and Celeritas's disapproval. It was unpleasant to think that by showing such an evident partiality for Rankin's company, he'd given himself the character of approving the man's behavior. Here was something for which he had rightly earned the cold looks of the other officers, who obviously know how Rankin behaves. It was of no use to say he had not known. He ought to have known. Instead of putting himself to the trouble of learning the ways of his new comrades in arms, he had been happy enough to throw himself into the company of one they avoided and looked at askance. He could hardly excuse himself by saying he had not consulted or trusted their general judgment, because they're already showing they're avoiding this guy. He calmed himself only with difficulty. He could not easily undo the damage he had done in a few unthinking days, but he could and would alter his behavior henceforth. By putting forth the dedication and effort that was only Temeraire's due in any case, he could prove that he neither approved or intended to practice any sort of neglect. By courtesy and attention to those aviators with whom he would be training, like Berkeley and the other captains of the formation, he could show that he did not hold himself above his company. These small measures would take a great deal of time to repair his reputation, but they were all he could do. The best he could do was resolve upon them at once and prepare to endure however long it would take. I'll have to pause with you here again, but piecing this chapter together for you so you don't have to wait. Stay with us.